Okay, well, good evening, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and begin. Respect everyone's time who came out with us this evening. My name is Dan Olson. I'm the superintendent for the Monona Grove School District. And as you all know, we're here tonight to talk about facilities planning. So tonight, what we'd like to do is talk about the process and where we're at this point with our facilities planning. We've had a facilities advisory committee that has been working for about the last 3 or 4 months, and we're tonight going to present some of those preliminary recommendations as well as background information, options that they considered, and so on. So I'll be presenting some background information that the committee was working with, but then we'll turn it over to a couple of our committee members to talk about the work they actually did in reviewing that information and these initial conclusions and work that needs to be done. And then we'll also have then some information about some costing and an opportunity for questions and conversation as we wrap up tonight. So we're hoping for about a 45-minute, to hour at the most presentation. Understand this committee's been working for several months and many meetings, so we're going to try to give a very high overview of the process and the work they've done, but then make sure we allow plenty of time for the individual questions and conversation that will occur, afterwards. So to begin to talk about the process, we'll start going back to 2008. That was the last time that the district built a new school. Glacial Drumlin opened in 2008. And from that point, there are several things that have happened in this planning process leading up to where we're at today. So in 2014, we started to see some enrollment growth. And so we had a formal enrollment study done at that time. Vanderwall and Associates was hired by the board to do that study. We'll talk a little bit more about what that enrollment study looked like and the results of that. And then the next year, we did a facility study in 2015. So again, we hired Epstein Ewan Architects to help us with that facility study to really do an assessment of our current buildings, to look at maintenance needs as well as educational needs of the buildings themselves. And then the board formed a committee at that time, a long-range facilities planning committee. And so that committee had done some initial work looking at those initial findings in that facility study and made some very initial recommendations as far as what work needed to happen to move forward. We planned on having more of a continuous process in that work, and we did continue that study internally with our administration. But then in 2016, we had a bit of a budget crisis, and so the work was kind of put on hold as we focused on an operational referendum. And we'll talk a little bit again about what that operational referendum was about and how that differs from, or how that relates to the work that we're doing with facilities. After that, then we, in 2017, we updated our enrollment study and then moved forward with that information to the facilities planning that we are going to talk about tonight. So back to the 2015 committee. What did that group do? They had 3 initial recommendations from their preliminary planning and looking at our buildings. The first recommendation of the board was to accept that district-wide facility study. So actually a copy of it's sitting on the table. It's a large 3-ring binder, a lot of information about every building and what those needs were. We use as a baseline for the work that we needed to look at moving forward. Okay, secondly, and these are the much more detailed, and I realize these are in your notes, but I think it's really important that I just take a minute to go through each of these. One really important recommendation coming out is looking at developing grade configurations to predict predictable, realistic transitions for students. So those of you that have been in the district understand that historically we've had many different grade configurations of all the schools to best meet the changes in enrollment and so on. And of course that has an impact educationally as well. And so the idea as we do further study, whatever solutions might come up, that we try to have a consistent plan for the future to take into account educational needs as well as the facilities that we have to best use those. And of course, B is pretty obvious, maximize the space that we have efficiently. C, further develop that capital maintenance plan in detail. D, We looked at the property as well, as far as the property the district owns that is surplus not being utilized, as well as looking at the needs for the future. And then lastly, we looked at athletic facilities as well, as far as district-owned versus municipal-owned facilities that we're sharing with our communities. And so those were the preliminary recommendations about things that needed further study, essentially, moving forward. And so then the final piece was, of course, to recommend this to the board, let's move forward with phase 2 to study those things in more detail and then engage construction management and as well as architectural firms to help us through that study. So that was 2015. Initially, we probably would have continued right on in 2016 with that work, but as I mentioned, then we had the operational referendum, which of course became a priority of our board as well as our administration moving forward. So let me just revisit that again, briefly remind everyone what that operational referendum was about. Remember, operational referendums represent an opportunity to exceed our revenue limits. So it's for our day-to-day expenses, our annual operating bench expenses. So that's everything that goes into the budget. So as a point of reference, right now our overall general fund budget for the district is about $40 million annually. And that operating referendum was to, at that point, back 2 years ago, I believe we must have been at about 35 or 36, and it was to exceed that limit by 2.6 million to carry on with day-to-day operations. As opposed to a referendum for debt. That's the referendum you have when you look to either build a new school or do major renovations to existing buildings where you are borrowing to do that. And typically there's debt service, borrowing over a length of period of time, many times 20 years and so on. So those are two very different types of referendums. And the one in 2016 was an operational for the annual budget day-to-day operations. The numbers that I put up here were the estimates that we used at that time about how that 2.6 million would be utilized. And in our budgets these past 2 years, we've actually been very close to those estimates. Of course, the exact amounts vary slightly in each of those buckets. But remember, to start with, we had an $850,000 deficit in an annual budget. So that's the first piece right off the bat to plug that hole. And then through a lot of discussion and looking at all the budget reductions that had happened over the years, and keep in mind, revenue limits were put in place in Wisconsin in 1993 for public schools. So for about 25 years, there have been nothing but freezes or cuts, not as far as not keeping up with inflation over that time. And so we looked at that point and determined and asked our taxpayers to support some additional revenue beyond that initial deficit. And so we looked at curriculum needs, technology, personnel, equipment purchases, and facility. And the big ones on there, the personnel, that was to specifically hire more teachers to reduce class size, as well as a couple support positions. Going to the facility piece, and we'll talk a lot more about that tonight, where that fits in, but that was to increase our annual facilities budget by about $500,000. And you'll see a little bit later when we talk about numbers where that fits into our current needs and why our current needs far exceed our ability to manage that with our annual budget of, and our annual budget slightly above that. We increased it by $500,000. At that point, we only had about $150,000 to $200,000 in our annual budget. That doesn't go very far when you're trying to repair roofs and parking lots and things like that. So again, we'll get into that detail a little bit more later. So that was the operational referendum 2016. Okay, so now let's fast forward to 2017. What have we done this past 6 months, and where are we going in the next 6 months? So in October, we engaged the board, put together the Facilities Advisory Committee, and we've been working on that up until this point. Moving ahead, we'll talk about more specifically about that we're doing the informational sessions. We'll be looking at community survey coming up. But looking ahead to the timeline, you'll see August of 2018 is the end point where the board at that point will be making a final decision about a facilities plan, whatever we're going to do in the future to address these needs. So we still have a long ways to go, another 6 months before there's any final plan in place with these needs. And our process tonight is give an update where we're at in that process and how we're going to get feedback to help the board make those decisions over these next 6 months. So I mentioned the board decided to put together a facilities advisory committee to help look at all this data in order to make recommendations to help advise the board moving forward. And so that was approved back in August, and they had 5 key charges for that committee. First of all, review all this background information and data that we have about our facilities and enrollment and so on. Secondly, take a look and analyze those facilities options. Third, assess cost and possible potential tax impact. And then 4, prepare a preliminary recommendation in advance of a community survey. And that's where we're at this point tonight. We're at that preliminary stage. And then finally come back, number 5, and prepare a final advisory report to the board. So again, tonight, as we move forward with this presentation, I'm going to speak to item 1 on the background information and a little bit of 2, but really the 2 and 4 about those recommendations and the analysis, we're going to have our actual committee members speak to that and the work that they did. And then we'll get into the costing that I mentioned and then the next steps moving forward. So before we go any further, I'd like to talk about, well, who those people are that have done this fabulous work. So we have 20 community members, no board members on the committee, no administrators, staff. This was strictly community members to take a look at the information that we have and to make these preliminary recommendations moving forward. So we had 20 community members. We made a point to make sure that we had 10 that were residents of Monona, 10 that were residents of Cottage Grove, and we tried to have a diverse group as far as some that have students in the school system currently, some that may formerly have, others that have other type of relationships with the school, to really make sure that we had a diverse point of views and that to really hopefully be representative of our community at large. And so if you wouldn't mind, before we go any further, we have a number of our committee members with us this evening. Would our FAC members please take a minute and stand up so you can be recognized, please? Okay. And also, before we go further, I'd also like to introduce our Board of Education members, and we have a number of those with us this evening as well. So would our board members please stand up? Now, in order to help us with this work and facilitate the planning of this committee, we actually engaged the work with 4 different consulting firms. Epstein Ewan Architects, Findorf, PMA Financial Services, and Vanderwall and Associates. And most of this work, and what we'll talk again about their role in helping providing data for us and information in the decision-making process. And we have folks from all those representatives from each of those groups with us tonight as well to help answer questions as we move through the process. Okay, so before we turn it over to our FAC members, just a summary of the work that they've done up to this point. They've met a total of 7 times over 4 months. As I mentioned, they reviewed the background information, analyzed enrollment, reviewed and discussed 7 options. We're going to talk about those tonight. It narrowed to this preliminary recommendation and provided a written report to the board. The one thing I want to emphasize before we turn it over is that these preliminary recommendations really are a lot of background information to be considered before we make any decisions. So there's been no prioritization that is done at this point. It's strictly data that's put together about needs, and that is part of this process about coming back and making those decisions at a later point. So again, I'm just going to go through a few more slides of some of that essential background information. So what started this process with regard to our facilities needs was the need for additional capacity. Okay, on this chart, you'll see this represents actual enrollment from 2007 to 2017-18. So over 10 years, the district actually saw an increase in enrollment of just over 500 students. And that was our starting point as we began this study. With our enrollment projections, okay, we're projecting, and there's a lot of data, and we'll talk about how these came about here later, but we're projecting another 700 students over the next 10 years. So clearly with that kind of growth, we need a plan about how we're going to accommodate that with capacity. Again, the committee spent a lot of time going through all the detailed reports. I mentioned we had the large 3-ring binder for our facility study. We had just as large a binder with the enrollment study, with all the background, where it came from, and so on. Okay, another key factor the committee looked at was open enrollment, and it's something we need to be aware of because it's often, sometimes we hear, well, why don't we just stop taking open enrollment students, then we'll have plenty of space, and that's a legitimate question to have. So I'd like to talk just a minute or two about how open enrollment works and why that is a piece of what we have to look at when we look at our overall enrollment. So right now, for our overall enrollment of just over 3,400 students, just over 3,075 are actual residents in the district and about 377 non-residents. The things that we need to remember is that school districts may only deny applications if there's not space available. And clearly we do have some space needs, and so we do deny a majority of the applications. However, we must accept a minimum number as required by law. So I'll give you an example of where we don't have a choice and we have to accept a minimal number at some grade levels each year. So there's a couple ways of identifying by law and by DPI guidelines whether or not we really have space or we don't have space. So we'll take Winnequa School here for example. Okay, at Winnequa School right now we have about 580 students. Our capacity is slightly more than 600. So we really don't want to be adding additional sections and getting up close to that 600, and we don't have to. We're not required to take open enrollment students if it means adding another section and hiring another teacher. However, we have to have a justification for that space also by grade level and by class. So for example, in kindergarten, we have a board policy that talks about the optimal size of a kindergarten class. And our board policy says that our optimal size, our goal is 20 students per section. And we have to identify a number for open enrollment purposes. So if our average class size is actually only 18, we have to take 2 students per section to fill to get to that 20 if we get those applications. Now we are allowed to reserve seats for potential new families and students that move in. And we do that, and we are very conservative. We pick that number as high as possible to save space so that we don't go over those numbers. But we have to have a justification. So we will see from each year that it's usually single digits, a couple kids per grade that we have to allow in, per law. And so over time, when that happens, for the whole district, we're slightly over 300. But at the elementary level, that doesn't get us to that 300 students. We're talking a couple kids per grade. The other place that we have allowed open enrollment is at the high school, the 9th grade, because we do have plenty of space at the high school, and it is an advantage for us to allow open enrollment students in, again, if we have the space and we have the staff to handle that. And so typically for several years, we've allowed all the applications in for 9th grade only, and that's usually ranged from 30 to 40 most years, sometimes as high as 45. And with the revenue that comes with those students, it actually far exceeds the actual cost for the teachers. And so in some years, we've actually used that to help reduce class size, where if we allow 10 students in, the revenue that comes with that is really enough to hire a teacher. And if that teacher can teach 20 to 25 to 30, you're able to actually lower class size by allowing a small number in. Now, at some point, again, I mentioned we don't want to have to allow so many in that we have to keep hiring staff. So we've actually not allowed any open enrollment at 9th grade the last 2 years, because we get to the point that our class size is where we want it, and if we had to allow more in, we'd have to add staff, and we're not ready to do that at this point. So we're able to manage those class sizes very well. So we're actually going to see that number of total open enrollment stay stagnant or actually decrease next couple of years as those other students move on and graduate that are currently in the junior and senior class. So it's something the board manages very, very carefully. They spend a lot of time looking and analyzing those numbers to make sure we take the minimal number possible. But the reality is we will always have some open enrollment in the district. Now, the other place that we have been able to deny open enrollment is at the middle school. You'll see in a minute the charts that show the capacity issues we have there. If we have an overall capacity of a school that we're at or above, that is another justification. We can say we're not going to take any students at that grade level. So again, I could probably talk an hour just about open enrollment, but I just wanted to give you a basic overview that is a key piece, but it's a very important piece that the board manages. And again, when we have the Q&A at the end and discussion, I'd be glad to talk in more depth if anyone has further questions on that. And again, that's something our committee spent a lot of time on. Okay, so what does the capacity look like? You can't see these numbers, don't try to look at the numbers. The most important thing is if you look at the colors on this chart. And it's a little bit difficult to see, but there's two colors. We've got the, I don't know if it's supposed to be yellow or green. Is it green? Shows the classes that are under capacity. So this is by building. So we have, this is not including our MG21 school, but Taylor Prairie, Cottage Grove, Winnequa, Glacial Drumlin, and the high school. You'll see this is our enrollment projected out over 20 years. So the first column is our actual enrollment in 2017-18, and then annual increases out for 20 years based upon our enrollment projections. And the key takeaways you should see are that 3 of the schools get into the red pretty quickly. Glacial Drumlin on the next to the bottom one is already there. The top one is Taylor Prairie. You'll see in 2 years we'll be at and then over capacity. Cottage Grove School 2 years later. The high school, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, that part is a little bit misleading. It shows us at or over capacity, but if you remember a minute ago I just said that we stopped taking open enrollment the last 2 years. Those projections were based upon if we were to continue that open enrollment, which we're not doing. So we can manage the high school. We're not going to be over capacity at the high school for at least 10 years out. The other thing in those numbers, those do include the numbers of students that are at MG21, which are actually in a different building. Right now it's about 45 students. So with that, and that's a really important piece that, you know, high school we're okay, but the other places are at or nearing capacity very quickly. The next chart is a lot easier to read. This is just a view of the next 5 years. And so you can see much more clearly, again, the 5 schools and where we're going to be at over the next 5 years. And so excluding the high school, we predict that that 3 of our schools are actually going to be over capacity by 22-23. Okay, I won't go into detail, but another thing that the committee looked a lot at was our capital maintenance, and the work that was done in the facility study and by EUA identified just about approximately $16.4 million of capital maintenance projects. Now, these are not the type of things that we can do in the annual budget, and Jerry can speak to that a little bit more later in detail. But you'll see the far and away the largest needs are right here at Winnequa School. Almost $8 million of capital maintenance needs, and these are high priority. Replacing piping, plumbing, windows, some work on HVAC, those sorts of infrastructure type things. And we have detailed information about this of all the different things that make up that, roofs, parking lots, and so on. But those are typically the capital maintenance things. District-wide, that adds up to about $16.4 million of really things that have been deferred that really need to be addressed very shortly. We also looked at renovations or updates. In some cases, it's a matter of some of our older classrooms that really just need some updated work to them. In other cases, it might mean a matter of we would like to be able to modernize some of the classrooms and make them more flexible learning spaces for how we're using them educationally now. In other cases, it's expanding core spaces like our libraries or our gymnasiums or cafeterias. For example, our cafeteria at Glacial Drumlin School, because of the overcrowding, we actually have to start serving lunch at about 10:30 in the morning. We have 4 lunch periods that go through to get all the kids through because there's not space in the actual cafeteria. Okay, this just gives a little bit more detail of what are those types of needs. It doesn't give the specifics. We have all that stuff charted out that we can share, but you'll see core classroom space, there's some work that could be done at each of the 5 schools. Cafeteria food service, 4 out of the 5 schools we have some needs. the gymnasium or fitness areas, 3 of the libraries, and the one that I would draw to the attention, the secure entrance, okay, here at Winnequa School. I would call it a semi-secure entrance. We still have the buzzer system to get in, but we don't have it that the visitors can go, right into the office or before they get into the hallways, into where the students are at. So that's what we mean by we would like to see an update as far as the secure entrance at Winnequa. But that is something that, of course, the district had made a priority, and about 5-6 years ago, remodeled all the entrances at all the buildings. Okay, the athletics. The primary challenge, and we're talking about outdoor athletics. The district actually only owns 3 sites or fields. Okay, at the high school area, we have the tennis courts, we have the stadium, which would include the track, and then the field that's used for both football and soccer. And then we have the practice areas. All 3 of those areas are in need of upgrades. They're really in a status of disrepair. The tennis courts cannot be used for varsity competition. They are used for Phi Ed and JV and practice. The track is usable, but at some point soon it needs to be replaced, and we're to the point we can no longer keep resurfacing it, that the base of it needs to be replaced. And then in a perfect world, there are some upgrades to the stadium area as well that could use. So we've looked at not only those needs of repairs, but the idea that what about all the other athletic fields that we have relationships with the city of Monona and Village of Cottage Grove? Might, in some of those cases, it be advantageous to have our own sites. And so those are things that we've looked at. Again, we'll talk about those a little bit. Those are just lists of things that we, in a perfect world, would like to have. We'll be talking about prioritization, a little bit later. Okay, so that is meant to be, a broad overview, but now really the specific work of what the committee looked at and their preliminary recommendations and needs for further study. We're going to turn it over to our actual committee members. So, Joe, if you would like to.
Thank you very much, Dan. My name is Joe Oyama Miller. I've been a resident of Monona over 40 years. I have 3 children that went through the school. I had 3 international students that also went through our high school. I have served on a variety of committees over the 40 years, whether they be at looking at closing schools, readapting schools, the school referendums. So I was really pleased to ask to be on this committee again. Our current configuration. Our committee looked at 7 different options, and I'll be glad to talk to you about all of those options at some point after the meeting. But what we came down to was to look at what the current configuration is that we have K4 and 1 at Taylor Prairie. Cottage Grove is 2 to 4. Glacial Drummond right now is 5 through 8 and at capacity. And then Monona Grove High School is 9 to 12, and then MG21, our charter school, is at Nichols. All students in Monona come here to Winnequa School from 4K to 5, and then go into our middle school. Overwhelmingly, the committee agreed, looking at this current configuration, that the 5th grade students from Cottage Grove needed to be out of Glacial Drummond. We felt that 5th grade students are better served in an elementary setting. Not only is it in the best interest of those 5th grade students, but it helps alleviate the enrollment pressure at Glacial Drummond. It also brings greater district alignment with elementary students in both Cottage Grove and Monona remaining in this elementary setting through 5th grade. Let's see if I can do this a little bit easier. The 7 options explored were extensive. We looked at different ways schools can be configured, whether it be neighborhoods or transitions. In reviewing the options, the committee weighed the different grade configurations, the implications of attendance boundaries, the impact of bringing Monona back online as a district school, and numerous other factors. We eliminated 5 options. So then we were left with our preliminary recommendation and one additional consideration. We forward this recommendation to the board in a written report and presentation on February 14th. The 7 options explored, the similarities were that all of them would place the 5th grade at the elementary level district-wide. We would construct a new elementary school in Cottage Grove. We would do renovations of all the existing school sites. We would look at update and consolidating the athletic facilities, and that the funding of the $16 million in priority capital maintenance need was critical. The difference were, should we create our schools as transition? That means that all children go to the same grade level in each of their communities. Or neighborhood schools, is you create schools that based on where you live would be the school that you went to. And we had a great discussion on that. We looked at different ways of grade configuration, and Monona has undergone a lot of different grade configuration. My children had class sizes, some of them to 30 students, others went through kind of different groupings over the years. And one of the things we realized is that children can learn at a variety of grade configurations. So the committee was asked to look at them, but not get stuck on them, so that we could then have some ability to create schools that would give academically the best that we can offer them. And then we also looked at what is the utilization of Maywood School. So some of our preliminary recommendations were, we needed to look at additional capacity. We all looked at the 4K through 8 capacity to meet those long-term enrollment projections that Dan just mentioned. Looking at the capital maintenance, the addressing of the $16.4 million in priority capital maintenance. Renovations, what did that mean for future schools to update the classrooms, create more modern and flexible learning environment, expand core spaces, and create more equity between schools. And then again with our athletic, what needed to be done to update the existing facilities, and how can we centralize practice and competition fields to reduce the use of shared facility. But we also looked at a consideration at grades 4K to 2. Our consensus with preliminary recommendations was to look at 82 to 88.7 million to expand the capacity by construction of a new 3 to 5 elementary school on district-owned land adjacent to Glacial Drummond, address those capacity needs and priority maintenance, and then the remodeling. We also did not rule out an additional consideration in terms of grade configuration, but I'll talk about that later. But it was not our recommended option. We wanted to make sure that the school board also had flexibility to discuss and gather additional information. So this was our preliminary recommendation, is that we would go ahead and make Taylor Prairie in Cottage Grove 4K to K. Cottage Grove School would become a 1-2 school. A new school would be for all 3rd and 5th graders, and Glacial Drummond would be a true middle school at 6-8. Our high school would remain the same at 9-12, and then MG21 as an alternative charter school. All students in Monona would continue to go from 4K to 5, and then transfer to Glacial Drummond. And it took a lot of deliberation and discussion to get to those things. And one of the things that we wanted to make sure that all Cottage Grove remained together. No divisive attendance order would be implemented if we used this preliminary recommendation. The entire grade level staff in one community can plan together. So all of 4K teachers can plan. We can have, and it can co-op. We recognized that the transitions were maybe more than we liked, so we were willing to consider other things as well. We also realized that sometimes transitions where you keep students in the same grade level going forward, may mean less opportunity for mentoring or less stability in school communities. For example, in PTOs, you'd have a PTO at 4, do you have a PTO at 4K? Do you have one at 1-2? And do you have a 1-3-5? Which makes it more difficult for families to have that sense of being together within an educational system. Some of our additional considerations, I said we talked about, was that what if we made Taylor Prairie and Cottage Grove a school that was 4K to 2? Because one of the discussions we had is if you went back to the first recommendation of 4K to K, was that really giving students in Cottage Grove a true academic and environmental sense of being in school rather than more of a preschool program. And then you would put all the students in 3-5 and 6-8, and that would mean one less transition. There would be more continuity and stability for students and parents. But on the other hand, you'd have to implement attendance boundaries in Cottage Grove. And that we saw as a real potential for divisiveness. We would look at the potential socio-economic and/or economic inequities between the schools based on where you had those neighborhood schools and how you broke up the division. We felt that keeping the grade levels in our first option eliminated those inequities, and we really began to focus on what was equity for all students, because Cottage Grove is quite different in the fact that they have more students but also more options. We're here in Monona, we're fortunate that our students have only one school and one transition before they get to the high school. We thought that also that we would keep this as an option so that when the community survey went out, we wanted to hear from what the community said, because maybe we were wrong as committee members. Maybe we placed too high a priority on transitions, and maybe people did want the old-fashioned neighborhood schools. But it's now going to be up to the community to give back feedback to us. The other thing we were lucky to is that the school board and others had some long-term planning even before we were created as a committee, that they bought land. And so that we don't even have to think about, if we build a new school, where would it be in Cottage Grove? Because we already own that land that's adjacent to Glacial Grooming. It's approximately 40 acres, and that was done last year. Central to our preliminary option was to make sure that Cottage Grove, which is the projected enrollment growth, would be able to handle their school population into the future. And we didn't even want to think about just 5 years, but now the 10 and 20-year scenario. Should this plan move forward, the proposed site for the school is approximately 40 acres, and it is sufficient to hold an elementary school from 3 to 5, and with the potential of using some of that other property as the necessary fields for the athletic community as well. So what would this new school look like for grades 3 to 5? It would be located on district-owned property. We're projecting that's 10 sections per grade level. It would have a capacity for 700 students, and it would approximately be 126,500 square feet. And let's see. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Patty, who will talk about some of the other key considerations that we talked about. Do you need that? You good?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you, Joy, or Joe, sorry. An introduction of myself. I'm actually a Cottage Grove resident. I'm the opposite of Joe, where she's been in Monona for 40 years. I've only been in Cottage Grove for about 8. While her children are long gone, mine are right in the thick of it right now. I have a 3rd grader at Cottage Grove School, and I have a 6th grader that goes pretty fast at Glacial Drumlin. So it was great to work with some of the Monona counterparts but that's a little bit of background about me. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the other things that our committee discussed, and hopefully this will answer some of the questions that you might have. And one of the burning questions that we discussed, probably more than we should have, but it kept coming back up, is what about Maywood? Why aren't we using Maywood? We have a Maywood school. Ultimately, what our committee decided is that Maywood is simply not an option for a couple of reasons. First of all, if we look at the current state of Maywood, it has a very limited capacity. It's a capacity of only 300 students. And as you consider that information that Dan shared, that doesn't solve our problem for a couple of reasons. First of all, when we looked at those red boxes on the enrollment charts, where were the red boxes? Cottage Grove. So adding 300 student capacity in Monona is not solving our problem, because our board has an unofficial policy, I believe, that we do not bus elementary school students from community to community. The second thing that the committee talked about extensively is, because our capacity issues at Cottage Grove, either way we have to add capacity in Cottage Grove. So adding Maywood and opening Maywood simply is doubling our need for additional operational expenses, because once you bring a new school online, while the students are funded through tax dollars or whatnot, you still need administrators, maintenance, support staff. And so really it's just adding a whole lot of operational costs that we don't currently have, nor do we need, nor does it solve our problem. The third option, or the third reason that we have ruled out Maywood, is because the remodeling costs that it would take to bring that school up to the standards that we currently expect for our children are just pretty astronomical. Currently that school is used by Madison for their Hispanic immersion program, but it's not suitable to be a junior high, for example. We talked about maybe it would become a junior high for the Monona students, but it would take a lot of investment to bring that facility to where you could have, say, the science capabilities that you have over at Glacial Drumlin currently. So as we talk about that equity issue and wanting to make sure that we're giving our Monona students the same quality experiences that we're giving our Cottage Grove students, we didn't feel like that was an option. I kind of touched on the programmatic limitations a little bit there. That's related with that remodeling cost. To be able to bring it up to the standards that we need, we'd have to spend a lot of money, but even then it has severe limitations, both because of its size, its age, and what we'd have to spend per square foot to bring that up to standard. And then I already touched on this one, but we can do whatever we want with Maywood, but at the end of the day, it's not solving our problem, because again, the growth in enrollment in the next 10 years is coming from Cottage Grove. And so that's not solving our current problem. So that is why we have ruled out Maywood. If you want additional discussions, the committee is happy to talk with you after the presentation today. The second building that people like to talk about and point to is the NICHOLS building. So why don't we just move people back into NICHOLS? Well, unbeknownst to me really, because again, I'm a Cottage Grove resident, but NICHOLS is already in use. And if you haven't, I'm not sure if people are allowed to go through there or talk to us what's in there, but NICHOLS is used by two different things. First of all, it's home to our district offices, and that takes up a considerable amount of space. But you remember those bubble charts that were shared, it talked about MG21. Now, MG21 is our charter high school. Dan mentioned it houses about 45 students, a liberal arts charter school, and that's housed there as well. So there isn't currently enough capacity to bring in any grade levels into NICHOLS, not to mention there would also be significant renovation costs associated with that. And to reiterate what Dan talked about earlier in our talk, we did talk about the high school, because as we saw from the chart, in about 10 years we are going to have capacity issues over at the high school. So our advice to our recommendation rather to the board was like, we need to watch the high school, but we're not going to deal with it currently, other than some of the renovation recommendations that we put forward. There was one other thing that we talked about in our committee, because as we went through the 7 different options that are outlined in the back and maybe in your packets, a couple of committee members consistently brought up the thing, well, there's one option I don't see outlined here, and that's the option of doing nothing. We don't want to spend money right now. And we understand it's a really bad time to come and ask the community for money. It's never a good time to ask for money, right? But sometimes are worse than others, particularly when we're looking at our tax base, perhaps taking a hit, perhaps when we're looking at some municipal costs that might be going up. But we feel like we cannot wait any longer on this, and there's a real cost. if we do indeed do nothing. First of all, in the next 5 years, we will be over capacity in 3 of our schools. Nope. In 3 of our schools. So where are we going to put those kids? You have to put them somewhere. Doing nothing has them out in the parking lot right now. So we have to do something or we're going to be over capacity. Second, you look at not only where are they physically going to go, but you look at when you start jamming that many people into a space, what does that do to the quality of education that we're delivering to our students? And what does that do to our ability to attract and retain the best possible education leaders, our teachers and our administrators? They don't want to be piled in there like sardines either. And so when they're feeling a constant strain of overcrowding, our ability to attract quality talent decreases and the stress on our students increases. They touched earlier in the presentation about the $16.4 million in capital maintenance needs. Again, as Dan mentioned, that's not something that we can really wait on either. Things like roofs don't wait. They're just going to get worse and worse until they start leaking. If you don't fix it now, it's going to be more expensive later. That was something that we actually learned a couple of years ago when the board looked at it. We had about $14 million of imminent capital maintenance needs, but because of the operational referendum that had to be put on hold, so now a couple of years later we're up to 16.4. What is waiting going to do to that? That number is only going to continue to skyrocket. In addition, with that, we know that the cost of construction never goes down and the cost of money rarely goes down. So again, deferring capital maintenance is not something that the committee nor the board, or I can't speak on behalf of the board, but I can speak on behalf of the committee, we are not comfortable doing. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jared, who is going to talk a little bit about the cost impacts.
Thanks, Betty. Good evening. As Patty stated, my name is Jared Rosing, and I'm actually the Director of Business Services with the Monona Grove School District. And so I'm happy that you guys came out tonight to learn about the process that we went through. It's been a very long process, but a very good process to make sure that we're looking at all the options, because it's very important that we look at that, especially when we're dealing with our students. That's the number one reason that we're here, and that's the number one reason that our budget's put together. And so making sure that we have quality educational opportunities is a very important part. So my portion of the presentation is talking about preliminary costs, and then ultimately, what does tax impact look like? Which a lot of times is the driving factor, and we understand that, and sometimes that can get in the way of what's best for our students. But that's why we want to make sure that as we look through this, we're being very clear. Before I switch to the next slide that lays out the entire total cost, I just want to remind everybody that this is a preliminary. This does not mean that the district is going next week to a referendum for the total dollar amount. There is a long process still ahead of us, from the point of continuing conversations with the Board of Education, community feedback through the community survey, and then some additional conversations with the Facility Advisory Committee and the Board of Education before anything is determined. So actually there was a handout that you could have grabbed as you came in, and it looks like this. It has the 2 options at the top, and then it talks about price and tax impacts. So when we talk about, or as we rolled out the preliminary options or recommendations from the facility committee, we recognize that there's a range of $82 million to $88 million. Like I said, that does not mean that we have to do all of it at once. We wanted to make sure that we put everything on the table. We didn't want to go through a process where we just identified one thing, and then a year later we come back and identify some more things, and then it just seems like there's not true long-term planning that's happening. So we've broken this down similar to the different recommendations that the committee had presented. The first one is if we were to build a grade 3 through 5 building, that ranges from $33 million to $37 million. The next portion of this chart is actually the renovation. So that's where we're talking about coming into the buildings and updating the buildings to meet the educational needs of our students. Updating our cafeterias, making it so we don't have to have for lunch periods, being able to convert art rooms, update our areas of our IMC, where if you've been in Winnequa, it's a great IMC, however, it's fairly old. So by bringing in additional technology resources and being able to make it flexible seating allows that. So this is broken down by each of the buildings, and then that ranges between $18 million to $20 million. Then the next section is the capital maintenance. Patty did a phenomenal job, so it definitely helped me in having that conversation tonight. But when we went out for the 2016 operational referendum, we talked about having capital needs of $14 million. We asked for approximately $600,000 of that 2.6 to be applied towards capital maintenance. That is happening, but the problem that we're seeing is that this long-range facility plan, or the maintenance plan that's in the binder over there, was done back in July of 2015. We recognized $14 million worth of needs in 2015. Then the next category was 2 to 5. So there are things that we've checked off the list through the operational referendum, but those things that were part of the 2 to 5 are now. So we didn't take care of all the urgent needs. Now we've added some of those things that were in the 2 to 5 year category. And then if we look at the outdoor athletic facilities, we have broken this down to 2, but it would total between $13 million and $14 million. So when you add those 4 different sections, that's where we're coming up with the $82 to $88 million. Like I said, I just want to say it one more time. These are just things that we've analyzed. We believe they're important things, and that's why they're on the table, so we can start collecting feedback from our community to find out what is the most important and working its way down. Now as we move into taking that $82 to $88 million worth of potential expenditures, when that happens, the district can't just go out and build a new school or do all those things. We have to come to the community through what we call a referendum. As Superintendent Olson had stated at the beginning of the presentation, there are 2 types of referendum. One for issuing debts, which would take care of building a new school, which would take care of renovating our schools, which would take care of doing our outdoor athletics and our capital maintenance. So if we were to take that and do $82 million to $88 million and finance that over 20 years, just like our mortgage would be, we'd make some assumptions that right now interest rates, we believe that we can get an interest rate of approximately 4%. We can take our current debt schedule and we can overlay the new debt schedule to sort of look at that. So what we do is then we determine what that looks like and we apply that to our tax value. And right now what we're looking at is the highest mill rate using assumptions is 78 cents to 91 cents per $1,000 of fair market value. So we just have one example, otherwise the slide gets very, very confusing. So if you had a house valued at $100,000, the highest tax impact that you would see at that 78 to 91 cents per thousand would be approximately $78 to $91 annually increase. Now that's what we would classify as the highest, and then over years that dollar amount is going to fluctuate, but it's going to go down. We don't want to tell you that in year 1 it's going to be this, and year 2 it's going to be this, and then there's the potential that it's going to fluctuate. There's a lot of things that we have to deal with that's out of our control. And I say that is because the state budget that gives school districts money is only done on a 2-year basis. So we also have to try to predict what's going to happen at the state level when it comes to taxes or equalization money from the state. The second side of things is very similar to our operational referendum. So as we talked about, opening a new school, we can go out and ask for a referendum and to build that and offer up the debt. However, in order to open up a school, we have to pay for some things that are sort of just basic there. If we open a new school, we're going to have utilities. We open a new school, we're going to have some health assistance, we're going to have clerical, we're a custodian, administration, a librarian, those types of positions. And that's where the second potential question for a referendum comes. And that's when we look at $840,000 to $930,000 annually just to open up the school. This is not paying for teachers. This is, the teachers typically follow the students. So if you have been to one of our budget hearings or annual meetings, you'll understand that school budgets are driven by enrollment and our revenue limits. So the number of resident students we get is determining the number of how much revenue we're going to collect in that year between property taxes and the state. So when we look at that, we're saying that about $840,000 to $930,000 is what we would need annually. So we would have to ask for the voters to approve that so we could open up the school at the same time. Same concept when it comes to the mill rates. We'd be looking at an additional 42 cents to 46 cents per $1,000 of property. So you'd be looking at $42 to $46 and at the highest point of the on your taxes if this was the actual question that was answered or asked from the community. And I'll turn it over to Superintendent Olson.
All right, so looking ahead to next steps, and I mentioned what you received in information this evening. It was a very high-level overview, reminding you that our board, our committees have been meeting hours and hours and hours to put this together, but we want to make sure that you have the big picture and then all the details that we can try to have an opportunity to have those conversations, not knowing what interest each of you might have individually. So I'm sure on many of the slides tonight, you'd like more detail, and we're going to have time afterwards to make sure you get those questions answered. So, next steps in the process. We mentioned we have these preliminary recommendations, a lot of information. There's been no prioritization done at this point about what are the most essential projects in this group of potential projects. So looking ahead, besides having these general informational sessions, we are in April going to have a community-wide survey where every resident will have an opportunity to complete the survey, to give the board, give our committee feedback to help with this prioritization as to which of these projects are most important, as well as when they need to occur. And so our purpose of this community survey, gather broad community feedback about the process and the information. We need to make sure we have a public voice in this decision making. Obviously, it's funded, anything that would happen is funded by the taxpayers. The other important piece is to communicate the important information. So a lot of the feedback that we're going to get tonight, we're going to find out some of these details are really important we need to expand upon. So when we do the survey, along with that is a lot of information that will go with it to every household so you can make informed decisions when you're filling out that survey. And then lastly, make sure we have a lot of independent, credible data to consider moving forward. So we want to make sure that everyone understands that survey will be coming out in April. We'll certainly try to communicate to watch for that. But as I mentioned, it'll be available and sent to every household. So then, again, a reminder of the timeline. This is something we had earlier, and I think there's an individual sheet. But we're right now in the phase up here through February. We've had the board do their preliminary recommendations. We're in this communication phase of presentations and listening sessions. This survey is going to be developed now by the board over this next month based upon the information we have from the committee as well as the feedback that we might get from these listening sessions. The community survey in April, and then we go back to the committee again. Now they'll have real data to help them do the final work of making prioritizations and a final recommendation to the board. And then once that board receives that in June, they'll spend the next 3 months discussing and really looking in detail about what those recommendations are, with the goal by August to actually make a decision about a final facilities plan about whatever that might be moving forward. So we have a lot of time. We're very early in the process, but we want to emphasize that that input is just critical in that next step in moving forward. So, mentioned we gave a lot of high-level overview information. Now we'd like to take time to get into those detailed discussions, questions. And so what we're going to do, instead of trying to have individuals ask questions, I'm certainly not the expert in everything. We have a lot of experts in the room. We have many of our committee members here, those are the folks that spent all this time going through the data. We want to make sure that we're all accessible to help answer the questions that you have. So what we're going to do is have, by groupings and tables, all of our experts around that we can have those individual conversations and answer questions and gather feedback at the same time. So Vanderwall and Associates are here tonight. Very critical piece in this was our enrollment study. So they'll be able to answer any questions about where do these numbers come from? What's the methodology? How do we know that these projections are accurate or reliable? So we'll have one group with our folks from Vanderwall. We'll have a second table with our experts from Epstein Ewan Architects and Findorf. They'll be able to address any kind of questions that we have on the facilities recommendations, facilities planning, design, capital maintenance, and the cost estimating. Where do these numbers come from? How do they derive these costs? Third, Jared Rosing, our business services director, will be at a table and be able to answer any questions with regard to costing and tax impact and so on. Okay. And then I will be joined at the table by a number of our committee members to answer any background questions about the process related to the next steps, the things with the grade configuration, everything that the committee went through in their decision-making process. Okay. So the other thing that we'd like you to do before you leave tonight is on the table, hopefully you picked up a feedback form. Okay, I'm sorry, it's being handed out now. Please take a few minutes and fill out that feedback form before you left as well. This is our first opportunity of getting that community feedback and these steps moving forward. Please visit one of our resource tables before you leave to either ask questions or offer comments. After you leave tonight, if there's additional things that come up, you can always contact myself directly. I will get you to the right person if I can't answer myself. We'll try to continue to get these resources out on our district website. Please visit that. There should be links from the home page to all the information in much more detail. All these detailed information pieces that our committee members had will be available online that we can share out as well. Okay, so with that, thank you so much for coming this evening. Please spend some more time with us visiting before you leave, and we'll move on to our breakout tables. Thank you.